Rule of Law Partnership Project is a joint project of Supreme Court, USAID, and UNDP. Is looking to conduct a study of international court performance experience and develop methodologies that can be applied in Uzbekistan. So the project has invited Kathryn Harrison, international consultant in strategic planning and management of judicial systems, to provide this international study. And Kathryn has extensive experience in the justice sector, about 18 years of executive positions in the judicial branch in California, and management positions in the executive and legislative branches. Kathryn also has an extensive international experience with various projects of World Bank and USAID. Several projects were implemented in Balkans and also in Central Asia, Armenia, Georgia, Indonesia, and Nigeria. Kathryn, can you tell us more about functional analysis and review based on your experience?
Thank you very much. I want to reflect on two projects that we worked on. I don't know if I should camera you, but anyway, I want to reflect on two projects. One in Macedonia and the one in Serbia, where we looked at doing a functional analysis. The first one in Macedonia was a relatively straightforward functional analysis that only asked one question, which is, what are the major functions that the courts are doing that someone else should be doing? So for example, they were doing a lot of work in customs inspections that should be done elsewhere by the executive branch, and then calculating what could be moved in terms of employees and resources from the courts to the other branches of government. That was a pretty straightforward exercise because it looked at a major function and asked where should it go and how much will that mean in difference in resources in the judicial branch. But what it didn't do, that study, is try to look at not just a major function, but at the tasks within functions. So let's say there's something that the courts really should be doing, but the question is, are they doing it well? Are they doing it fully? Are they doing it efficiently? That is not something that can be answered easily. That requires a lot of in-depth study of court operations, understanding how they actually do their work, not just the judges, but the court employees, etc. The other piece of it that could not be answered with the approach we took there was what they should be doing that they were not currently doing. Are there major tasks that should be carried out by the courts? So if there's an attempt to look at a narrow scope of removing functions from the judiciary, major functions, that might be an appropriate way to go about it. What we did in Serbia was much more wholesale. We tried to answer the questions about what are the functions that are being done currently by the judiciary. Are they being done well? Are they being done efficiently? Do they provide quality services? Does the public have access to these services? And how can that model be changed internally? What things could be different in the courts? A large part of that is taking comparative information between courts and using that to decide what is causing different performance. So we use the averages of court performance and say, this court seems to be completing its cases much more quickly than the other court. Why is that true? What are the differences? But it's not just saying this one is doing a better job than that one. You then have to understand what underlies that. Is it a resource problem? Do they have fewer resources? Is it a management issue? Is it possibly an issue of the types of cases that they have? So I've had a long experience in Serbia. I started working there in 2008 for USAID, and then in 2010 went to work with the World Bank. And the first thing we did was what was really supposed to be a functional review. And this study went on for a couple of years, and it was never released. And there were reasons for that. There were problems that came up. For example, we didn't really know what the goals of the justice system were. We hadn't stepped back and first said, what are we trying to accomplish in the justice sector?
Because the results need to be compared against some certain targets, right?
Right, exactly. So what are we trying to accomplish? What are the major areas we want to look at, and what are the targets we're trying to reach? We also didn't have an understanding of the goals of the project. Were we trying to address the questions, as I mentioned in Macedonia, of just what should be removed, or were we trying to look more in depth at the internal operations? We didn't yet have a strategic plan for Serbia, so we had nothing to base this work in. And we didn't really yet have enough of an understanding of the system. This isn't something that happens overnight where you just say, well, this is how the courts operate. In their case, in the case of Serbia, we also had a problem with scope, a significant problem with scope. As opposed to here where you're looking at the civil courts specifically, these studies in Serbia were trying to examine the entire justice sector. So all parts of the courts, the prison system, the Ministry of Justice, prosecutors, the state attorney who deals with civil cases. So the scope was too extensive and sort of really impossible to accomplish. That's not a problem you have as much of here, but I will talk about scope again in a minute. And we also tried to include too many functions that were not related to court performance. So what do I mean by that? There are a number of employees like here that are technical employees, drivers, cleaners, etc., who are important from a financial point of view, how much do we spend on them, but they're not important for court performance. It doesn't really affect court performance. So spending time on looking at that turned out to be a not good use of time.
But here, in our case, this is not a problem, right? Because we're not looking at those performance.
Well, it depends how you design your functional analysis. So one piece of advice I would give is to make sure that you understand your scope really clearly. Are we talking about just court-managed functions? Here, the Ministry of Justice manages these technical employees. I would say they probably should be excluded. The Ministry of Justice also manages information technology and building, maintenance, and construction, and I'd recommend excluding those functions. Try to come up with a scope that's more limited. That also leads to the question about what kinds of courts you should be looking at. Are you looking just at first instance and the first round of this work, or you do want to include the second and third instance courts? And I would recommend starting with the first instance because you will learn a lot through that experience that can then be applied. After this project that did not work out well in Serbia, we then went and actually wrote a 5-year strategic plan for the entire justice sector. And I did that with the partners at the Ministry of Justice and the Supreme Court. And that became the basis upon which we could look at performance. That work took place in 2012, essentially, 11 and 12. And then in 2014, this is with the World Bank, we went ahead and did what I consider a real functional analysis. We said, here are the standards, we've already developed them, here's the scope, this is what we're going to be looking at. We looked a lot at internal operations, not so much from a task-by-task analysis, but more from using big performance data and saying, again, what drives these differences? So, for example, we tried to look at the time to disposition in each of the courts. And then for those that were not doing as well, tried to understand, was that a resource question? Was it a management question? Was it a question of the case types that they faced? And so we assessed that. So we used the averages and the range.
So the case per month, right?
In the, case, well, we used per year, but
Per year.
yeah, we used the experience of the courts themselves to evaluate where the issues might be. And all this background work proved sort of invaluable when we did this project. But nonetheless, I have to say, we had 10 consultants that worked on this for 5 months, and it was a real struggle. And it was a very successful project in the end. But again, it was based on a large number of available people and a mix of national and international experts, and also years of experience in the system, of looking at the system. Some of the problems we had even in this latest study were it was still too ambitious. We still tried to include the entire justice sector. Every time we tried to limit the scope, somebody wanted to expand it. So the prisons were in, they were out. Nobody could decide whether we were supposed to be looking at them or not, and that turned out to be a big problem. But a bigger problem was that we had a lot of data problems that we hadn't thought about enough in the beginning. So if we're going to look at comparing courts with each other, we have to ask, are we comparing all courts with each other or courts, for example, of like size? Do we want to look at small courts and how they perform as a group and individually and compare them to each other? Because they're going to have a very different picture. They're going to have fewer cases per judge because they're rural and they don't have as many cases coming in. But we still need a courthouse there because of access. So I think in the end we came up with good criteria for dividing the courts by size. But that was something that was floating around at the beginning of the project for about 2 or 3 months, and we hadn't settled on that. So one piece of advice is to settle on your analytical categories before you go ahead. The other thing is we had a very good set of standards that we had laid out, the performance standards. Our efforts to try and look at national legislation and how they fed into those standards, and international experience and how they fed into the standards was very difficult. Most international standards do not speak specifically about the internal operations of courts. International standards are focused on anti-corruption, on access to the courts, a lot on judges training, independence of the judiciary, etc. These sort of big picture items. But there's not a lot of guidance on things like internal operations. How much money should we be spending? What is the right way to think about that? So we turned to CEPEJ, the Commission on Efficiency of the Judiciary, and looked at what their experience was in other judicial systems, what they have found through surveys. And again, we're using actual data to compare performance. And we tried to find out where Serbia fit with that international experience, and then again, go ask the question, why are we not doing as well, or why are we doing better in some of these areas? So I think part of the lesson from that is to try to, in the beginning, determine what your what data you're going to use to compare with your national system, and to understand there's not a lot of data in some areas. And in fact, having worked in many of the systems that were included in the CEPEJ studies, I have to just alert you to the fact that much of the data is self-reported and is actually not accurate. So, for example, I had worked in another country in the Caucasus, which will remain nameless, and they reported they had a certain performance management system, and I knew that not to be true. But CEPEJ was limited to what they had been told. So we have to take all that with a grain of salt. And I know you've had that experience here with the World Justice Project, that some of the answers that they seem to have for Uzbekistan don't really fit your experience, and it's not clear where they came from. So that's just a warning about any of these international comparisons are a little bit insecure.
Yeah.
Do you have other questions of me?
Yeah, maybe you could like just summarize these takeouts. Like you have to have a strategic plan and things.
Yeah, I think the most important thing
Scope
is
and stuff.
to know what your scope is and to stick with that. Try to get everyone to agree on that and not start adding things back in, which is a temptation. 2, to have a set of strategic goals, and I can share those with you for Serbia and get a sense of what it is you're looking at. 3, to make sure that you define the data correctly. What courts are we going to compare against each other? Oh, and what time periods. This is another thing. I was working on human resources and management as well as access to the courts. And I had recommended using 3 years of data. The person who's working on finance was very, he wanted to know more. So he went out and got 5 years of data. But then his data wasn't comparable with my data. So making sure your data definitions are set from the beginning. What are we talking about? And one thing I should add about that is another really valid way to compare institutions is not just with each other, but over time. How did the court in Tashkent do this year compared to last year, compared to the year before? There's sort of 2 major strains. How is this court doing over time, and how is this court doing compared to other courts? So to keep both of those in mind. And that you need a lot of prep work. You need to have an understanding of the system and sort of scoped out how the institutions work, and finally you need to have an adequate number of consultants or
And it should be
staff.
like a cross-functional team.
Yes.
National and international. Because
Yes.
the national ones can provide the insight.
Yes, you cannot do it without a national team, but you also can't really do it without an international team, I think. And also cross-functional in terms of subject areas. So we had experts in finance, human resources management, information technology, I covered that area as well, facilities management, access to justice, quality, and efficiency. So we had separate people in all of these areas, and a consultant who worked on the national legislative piece and how it fit into this, and the international experience.
And what is the more exact definition of functional analysis?
I don't think there is one.
Maybe from your experience, like your conclusion, like what it kind of.
I don't think there is one. I think you have to decide what you're trying to accomplish. DFID, the British aid agency, started using this terminology quite a lot in the early 2000s, and people have interpreted it all different ways. So I really think that's a very hard question to answer.
And like in our case, what would be your recommendations for in case of Uzbekistan?
I think I would try to start with solidifying the performance management system first and knowing what it is you want to accomplish and how you're going to evaluate your performance. Try to get broad agreement on that before you do anything else. Also, I should say, going back to Serbia for a minute, one advantage we had is we had already done citizen surveys for 3 years running, so we had a lot of data from the citizen perspective already, which is very helpful. And you haven't been able to do that work yet, so perhaps try to get some of that done, an initial baseline at least of that data before you go ahead and do the functional review. So it'll give you clues as to what the areas are that might be problematic.
Yeah, and that five-year strategic plan that you mentioned, it was then adopted by the government?
It was,
What was
yes.
that process?
Yes, it was adopted by first the Minister of Justice and then the Supreme Court and then the government, and it was used in negotiations with the EU for Serbia to enter into Chapter 23 negotiations.
Yeah, I think you're okay. I think this is it, and thank you for your answers and the insight that you provided. Thanks.
Thank you again.